This is Friday, October the 18th, 2013. I'm Dennis Wendell, curator at the Ames Historical Society, with Teresa Larson, our media project coordinator. We'll be interviewing Dewey Fitch on the left, Norton Mezvinsky, and Rabbi Shmuel Metzger. Our theme today will be the experiences of Norton growing up as Orthodox Jew in the little town of Ames, Iowa. I'm guessing that there were very few Orthodox families in Ames at that time. Would you say less than a handful?
Certainly less than a handful. We were probably, during the early years when I grew up, the only Orthodox Jewish family. There were a couple other Jewish families in Ames. There was one other that might have bordered being Orthodox, but we were. And then when I went to school, through what we then called grade school and through junior high school, and until my junior year in high school, I was the only Jewish student. By the time I got to be a junior in high school, we had another family, the Sclero family, that moved into town, and the daughter and the son in that family, they also were then in school.
How about Max Deich?
Max Deich was the other family. When I said there was another family that bordered being Orthodox, it was Max Deich, and his wife was also named Fanny, the same name as my mother, and in fact we were close to them. And my mother and Mrs. Deich, or Fanny Deich, it was a regular routine, as I recall, for them to talk on the telephone with one another every day. And the Deich family lived exactly 3 blocks away. Our house was on 9th and Duff, and they lived on just off of 9th and Burnett. So it was 3 blocks away.
And Norton, could you please tell us when you graduated from high school so we'll have a time frame for when your family was in Ames?
I graduated from high school in 1950.
Excellent, thank you.
50. How about the Burke family? Were they Reformed?
The Burke family.
Ira Burke?
Ira Burke, that they also came later, and they were, we can say they were traditional Jews in some ways. And of course he opened up a clothing store, and then he had a son that also started school, but his son was in lower grades than I was. But the Burkes also came, yes.
It's interesting that both the Scleros, who were Sklevsky actually in Tsarist Russia, and Mezvinskys were both from that era and exceeded extremely well here.
That's right. The same era, same part of the world they came from. But of course, neither family knew one another until they met in Ames, Iowa.
That's right. So you went to grade school, junior high,
I went
high
to
school?
Beardshire Grade School, which was only 1 block away from my home. And I went to Central Junior High School. And then I went to Ames High School. That's, of course, the old high school that now is, what I understand, the City Hall. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes.
Now, there were only about 10,000 people in Ames when we were growing up.
That's right. And you, Dennis, lived a block away.
Block away, that's right.
Right. Yes,
So
about 10,000. That was the number. 10,000 in the town.
So did you feel pretty special or even isolated because of your religion?
No. The answer to that is no, and I can expand on that quite a bit. From my earliest years in school and so on, I never felt strange. I really didn't even feel unique. I knew I was different in religiously, and my friends and my classmates also knew that. But I would say, as I've said often, I've said it to Rabbi Metzger often, that my growing up as in a religious Jewish family in Ames, Iowa, where all of my friends in this town were, of course, not Jewish. It was a very good and positive experience, and I can exemplify that in a number of ways, with a number of stories. I'll just give one or two. I'll give one from the time I was in grade school. I forget what grade, but it was maybe 3rd grade or 4th grade, so it was when I was very young. When it came time for Christmas, in school, they sang Christmas carols, and I remember that the teachers came to me and said, "Listen, Norton, if you would like to be excused when we're singing Christmas carols, that would be fine." And I said, "Well, I don't think that I want to be excused at all." She said, "Well, would you ask your parents?" So I went home and I asked my parents, and I asked my father, who was a very Orthodox Jew, kept strictly kosher and so on. And my father said, "No, definitely not. You stay in class. You don't have to sing the carols, but you'll stay in class." That was the answer, and that gives you some kind of indication of not only how I felt, but how my father felt. And let me just put in one little story here about my father that illustrates it even more. My father often told the story that when he came to this country in 1911, from a little shtetl, or a little town in the Ukraine, that one of the things he was resolved on doing was coming here, doing something he could not do where he came from. He wanted to live as a Orthodox religious Jew among non-Jews. He didn't want to go to a place where he only lived around Jews and lived in a ghetto. He didn't have anything against that. He just wanted to live differently, and that seemed to him to be a very good thing to do, and that's what he did. He came to Iowa, and that's what he did.
Fascinating. Were all your classmates aware that you were?
All of my classmates were aware. They were also aware, and this was true until I got into college, they were also aware that I kept kosher, that I kept kosher to a certain extent. That is, I wouldn't eat non-kosher meat, and they all knew that. And even when I was on the football team and we used to travel, everybody knew that. And so there were special arrangements made for that. That's just one example. But let me give you another example, because this example includes my good friend Dewey Fitch, who's sitting right next to me. My father arranged for me when I was 5 years old. He said to me, "You need to get a Jewish education. You can't get it in Ames." And he said, "You can get it in Des Moines," which was about 30 miles away. So he went to Des Moines, and they had a religious school for a Jewish school for young people from all of the synagogues, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. My father took a look at that school, and for him, that school was not satisfactory at all. And so he found a teacher whose name was Meyer Dvorsky. Meyer Dvorsky was a very Orthodox Jew. He was well educated from Eastern Europe. In Des Moines, he was what often happened in smaller towns. He was, to use a trite phrase, the jack of all trades. He was the moil, who would be the person who did the circumcisions when a baby boy was born. He was the shochet, who would go to the packing house and would kosher kill the cattle. And he had been a teacher in the school, but they fired him from the school because, if the students didn't do their lessons, he wasn't against giving them a little slap on the arm, and that didn't go there. When my father found that out, my father said, "That's exactly the kind of teacher that I want for my son." All right, now, so the point is, so I studied. My father then told me, "Listen, Norton, I'm going to insist that you study from now until your bar mitzvah, when you're 13 years old. After your bar mitzvah, it's up to you." Now, I happened to choose after my bar mitzvah to go on and study, and I studied all the way through high school with him. But that was one-on-one. Now, I had to go to Des Moines. Sometimes my father arranged for someone from one of the stores to drive me back and forth. But by the time I got into high school, who often drove me to Des Moines and waited for me while I studied with Meyer Dvorsky? Dewey Fitch, my good friend from Ames. And so he drove me back and forth. And as he will tell you even more than I, he also liked the fact that my mother always fed him. But the point is, that's not why he drove me. So that gives you some indication of what it was like for me to grow up being Jewish in Ames, Iowa, with my very best friend being Dewey Fitch, who of course was not Jewish.
Dewey, let's hear your take on it.
Well, I remember the egg sandwiches that it might be. Norton's driving skills left a little bit to be desired, and driving was okay by me, and at nighttime it was just logical that somebody other than Norton drive down there. And so it all just worked out, and we had a good time. And we were good friends. We talked about all kind of things together, had similar friends, and so it was just natural.
Well, how did you kill your time then?
I don't recall. I probably drove around Des Moines.
In talking with your brother, it seems like he took a bus down. Would that have been possible?
Sometimes a bus, yeah. And then my brother, my father also, he said the same thing for my brother. He said to my brother was 4 years younger, is 4 years younger. He said to him, you have to go to your bar mitzvah. And he gave my brother had the same option. My brother chose not to continue. I chose to continue. But anyway, yes, sometimes we'd take a bus back and forth. But I'm saying that by the time I was in high school, I had a superb driver named Dewey Fitch.
Yeah, right.
Would you mind relating your experience in Red Oak? You had some claim to
Well,
fame there,
yes,
I believe.
what happened was my father came, when he came over, he came into Galveston, Texas. And then he had a sister who had come who had come earlier to St. Louis. And he had a brother, he was my Uncle Sam, his brother named Sam, in St. Joseph's, Missouri. My father went to St. Louis, and when he got there, a young man, he got a job. I'll say this quickly. He got a job, they got him a job in a shoe factory. And the first day he was there, he didn't speak English really very well. So he spoke to the man next to him in Yiddish, and he asked the man, how long have you been here? The man said, 5 years in this job. My father said, how much did you earn when you started? The man told him. My father said, how much do you earn now? He said the same. My father quit. He figured there's no future for a young man here. So then he went to St. Joe, Missouri, and he peddled fruits and vegetables in the street with my Uncle Sam. And he saved his money, and he met my mother, who had come from Warsaw. She was in Kansas City. They got married, and he saved up his money. And then, in 1932, just when the Depression had hit and was bad, he went to my mother and he said, listen, he said, I think that I have enough money to buy a small farm and a small store in Iowa. And he said, I've never been there, but I understand that Iowa has the best farmland in the United States. And he not only said that he wanted to live among non-Jews, but he said, I was never able to have my own business for everybody and a farm of my own. And so I want to go there and buy a little farm. My mother said, look, what do you know? You don't know anything about farming. You've never been to Iowa and so on. So my father said, listen, the worst thing that can happen is I'll go and I'll spend my money and I'll lose my money. Then we can always come back to St. Joe, and you know that I can make a living selling fruits and vegetables in the street. And by the way, he learned to speak English in the street because customers would teach him English and so on. So we got to Red Oak. So he had a little store, and we were in Red Oak, and we were there a couple years. And I was born in Red Oak. I came to Ames when I was 1 year old. I was born. Well, when I was born, there was, of course, no religious person, as you must have in the Orthodox faith, to do the circumcision. So my father sent an uncle of mine, my mother's brother, to Omaha, Nebraska, to bring, whom we call the Moyle, to do the job from Omaha. He brought him. He, he brought him to Red Oak. We had the bris. My father invited the whole town, and the next day, the newspaper, they said, first Jewish boy born in Red Oak. That's the story. And then a year later, we moved to Ames.
Fabulous. So your father would speak Russian and
He
Yiddish?
spoke Russian some, and he spoke Yiddish.
And Yiddish.
Yes.
So,
And then he came and he learned English here. He really learned it by talking with people. He told me another story once that's interesting. He said when he just started, he had one woman who was a customer who bought every day from him. And he also said he didn't know how to use the telephone. And she knew that. And she knew he didn't talk English well. So she said, listen, from now on, Abe, she said, I want you, before you start, call me on the telephone and I'll give you my order. And he looked at her and he said, as he told the story, he said, I don't know how to use the telephone. She said, that's why I'm telling you to call me. You call me, you'll learn how to use the phone and you'll learn English better. And he always told that as a typical story about how he learned English.
terrific. So, did you hear Yiddish around home at all? Or
Yes.
Did
What
you?
my parents did was a very good thing. When I was very young, they spoke Yiddish in the house. Why? Because, as my mother and father both said, they said, look, we don't have to teach you English. And they said that if we speak Yiddish in the house, then you'll learn Yiddish. And that's a very good thing. First you'll learn the language that we Jews are speaking, who come from where we came from. And, it's another language that's a rich language with a rich literature. And so that's how I learned Yiddish.
Fascinating, fascinating. Did your classmates ever express curiosity? Did they ask
often.
questions about your
They
culture?
all ask questions, and as Dewey knows, we used to talk. We used to talk about comparative religious themes. And then let me tell one other story. When I was in high school, we used to have what they call Brotherhood Week. We had Brotherhood Week in high school. And what they did during Brotherhood Week then, by now things have changed some in how they do and what they do, but it was very positive what happened. They had a whole week where they would bring in a minister from the town or nearby, and once in a while they brought a priest in, and he'd be there for the week, and he would give a few talks, but he would also counsel students who needed to be counseled. Well, when I was a junior in high school, I didn't suggest this, one of my classmates, non-Jewish, said, listen, we now need to have a rabbi come. We need to have a rabbi come. And as Dewey may recall, so actually the person put it, and of course he asked me what I thought, and I said, well, I said, of course I like that idea, but I said, I understand that I think that Marshall Sclero had just started high school, so we were the only two, we were the only two Jewish students. And then his sister started a little later, but I was a little reticent to start to insist that you bring a rabbi, but my classmates insisted. So then it went to the administration, and it went to the principal, and then the principal came and spoke with all of us, very concerned about this, and said, look, it's a wonderful idea, but he said, here's the problem, and he asked us, the students, what we thought about this. He said, the problem is, he said, almost all of our students are Christians, and if they have some personal religious problems, they may feel, far better if they go to a minister rather than to go to a rabbi. But he was looking to us to say whether or not a rabbi should be brought in. So then some of my classmates told me, listen, you tell us what you want to do. So I said, I'm going home and I'm going to talk with my parents. So I went, and I remember what my father said. My father said, look, he said, your principal is right. He said, you go back and tell them that, yes, they should bring a minister in. It was thank them for wanting to bring a rabbi. Say it would be a very good idea for them to bring a rabbi in to give some talks. And so they did that. So that also gives you an idea of what it meant for me as a religious Jew to grow up in Ames, Iowa.
Exactly. Were you ever asked to go around to different churches? And
I was asked to go to some churches to talk also. That's right.
Would these be to classes your age or adults as well?
No, they're two adults.
To adults.
I can tell you another story about what it meant to be Jewish in Ames, Iowa. Our grocery store, we used to call it store number 1 because my father ended up having 3 stores in town. 1, 2, and 3. Or one was the north side and the other was the Concourse. But the old store, as we called it, that's where I grew up. I worked in the store. 2nd and Elm. Yeah, I'm sure you remember 2nd and Elm.
Right.
Well, right across the street was St. Cecilia's, the Catholic church. Now, the priests and the nuns, and we had almost all the Catholic trade for a lot of reasons. We were there. They all loved my father. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2, we were the only grocery store in town at the time that was ever open on Sunday. My father opened for half a day because since he figured he had to open Saturday, even though it was his Sabbath, because it was the busiest day of the week, if he was going to do that, for him, he's going to open on Sunday. Well, of course, all the people around there liked it. We had the Catholic trade. And the priests and nuns, they always used to come in, and they knew that my father didn't want to go inside the church sanctuary. But they always came and said, Abe, we said our prayers for you today, and so on, and so on, and so on. They all did that. And then when this church, St. Cecilia, when they decided to build a new parochial school, my father gave them a very big donation to pay a good part of the building costs for that school.
Amazing. Amazing.
So all of this is how it was to grow up Jewish in Ames, Iowa. And you see why I view it positively.
Right. Could you confirm this story that a priest in his homily praised Abe? There is this tradition that in one of the sermons he used Abe as an example of the ultimate, beneficiary, helping people. Had you heard that?
Well, yeah, I've heard that.
I mean, he was almost considered an honorary Catholic, because he was such an example.
Oh, you mean the priest in the church?
Yeah, the priest in the church cited Abe as a prime example.
We always were told by the priests and by the nuns that and by some of the customers who, of course, were members of the congregation. We were always told that. Oh, yeah.
Right.
I mean, he was. I don't want to say he was. To use some Christian terminology, he was almost like a patron saint. Oh yeah,
I heard that.
They did that.
Well, Rabbi Metzger, what was your take on doing business on the Shabbat? Is that
his father?
You're right.
Is a very pious. Was a very pious man, and I'm sure that he found a way through the code of Jewish law to do it in a way that's permissible.
Right. I've always wondered, Ed your brother was quite the athlete. And of course, games were usually on Friday night.
Oh, I have a story. Okay.
Was this a conflict?
No. The answer is yes, but there's 2 parts to the answer. The football games are always Friday night. All right. Now, my mother, who was the glue that held the family together. And my mother also was the person who determined things for my father. She determined all the things in the family. She also determined what he wore every day because she said otherwise he'd wear the same sweater for 30 days in a row. But anyway, she's the one who told my father how this is going to be handled. Because I was on the football team, and I was very keen about playing football. And so she told my father, yes, he plays football. And she said, we may not go every Friday night, but we're going to go see our son play football on Friday night. That's one part of the story. Here's the other part. This happened twice. It happened that Rosh Hashanah, the High Holy Days, started, and they went over a Friday and a Friday night, And on the high holy days, we usually, when I grew up many times, we would go to Kansas City, Missouri, where my mother's mother was before she moved into our house, or sometimes we would go to Des Moines. So now it's the high holy days. So I knew that I'm not playing that football game on Friday night of the holy days. And so what happened was, you remember, I was played on the line. I was a guard, and the football coach for the line was High Covey. So, the first time I went to High Covey and I told him, and I must say, he didn't say this, but when I looked at him, when I looked eye to eye, I knew he wasn't at all happy. He wasn't at all happy with this. You know, it didn't surprise me. I was sensitive to it, you know. But I'll tell you, for him, it also became all right, because insofar as all of my colleagues were concerned, who were on the football team, that was just fine, and that was just the way it should be. So that's my story about that. That's the other part.
That's great.
So you're together with Hank Greenberg and all the other athletes who abstained from.
Rabbi Metzger, how long have you known Norton?
We've known each other for 8 years.
Is it that long?
Yes,
Okay.
there are 8 years.
Very good.
And aside from the fact that we know each other and we study together, the story of Abe Mezvinsky is very inspirational. Aside from the fact that it's his personal friend and his father, he's an icon. And the fact that there was a Jewish person as an icon in the city is very special. It's interesting because this week's what we call Divine Providence, or coincidentally we call it Divine Providence, this week's Torah portion speaks about the first Jewish person, Abraham. It was Abraham as well. And the sages ask, why is he considered the first Jew? Before him you had Noah, you had Seth, Sem, but Abraham is considered the first Jewish person. And the answer given is because he was open, his home was open to everyone. He was, although he was different than everybody else, he welcomed everyone else, and his home, and the same generosity and socially liberal spirit that's why in our time, a legend in our time. Norton's dad, it sounds like the same type of icon here in Ames.
Exemplified in Abe.
Our Abe.
Right. You knew the neighbors, the Coozers.
Yes.
Ted is quite a writer.
Poet laureate.
Poet laureate of the United States. And he has a story that the neighborhood kids would hide in the bushes between the houses.
When some of these looking came. Yeah.
When the rabbis came. And of course, that was pretty exotic. The black hats, the long beards, curled hair. For little Ames, this was fairly exotic. Were you aware of that going on?
Yes, but
Would you see them?
They did. When they were terribly small, that's how they acted. But actually, when they came, you see, after a while, as you probably know, people in town knew that every year, it didn't just happen once a year. It happened numerous times a year. So they knew whenever one of these people came, and when they came to our house, but then, 9th and Duff, it's only a few blocks from where our downtown was. And so they would walk there sometimes. So people saw them walking around the town, and everybody knew that, well, they just come to visit Abe, you see. So, they took it very, very well indeed. And I'll just say this one thing. Not only those of us in the family, we ask sometimes, but others would say to my father, why do you give to every one of them who comes? And some people would say, you should check out all those people. My father had a wonderful answer. My father's answer was, listen. He said, he had a lot of answers, but this is a wonderful answer. He said, I give because I should give charity. And he said the other thing, I remember he told my mother this once. He said, listen, he said, if we figure out how much I'm worth and and how many hours I work and what every hour is worth, he said, if I checked on every single person, not just these people, but others to whom I give, and we figured how many hours that would take and what those hours are worth, he said that would cost much more money than I even give. And so he said, look, if everything I give to everybody, not just to the Jewish rabbis, but to other people, if only 10% of it is positive and good, he said, look, then I'm doing this wonderful thing. It's a mitzvah, the Hebrew word for, the rabbi can explain even better than I. It's commandment, but it's also one of the best things to do. He said, then I'm really doing it if only 10% goes for good. That was his answer.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Oh, amazing. Was your mother quite a cook? She did the traditional...
My mother was more than a cook. My mother, she was a wonderful woman. She cooked everything in the house. We used to get the kosher meat. My father would go in twice a week to buy the meat and vegetables for the stores. They'd bring back kosher meat. And there was a kosher bakery in Des Moines. He brought back the bread. My mother did all the cooking. And the only trouble she had cooking was the trouble she had from my father. Because my father, he loved to be in the grocery store in the fruit and vegetables. And he would have an apron on. You wouldn't know he was the boss. He'd be trimming the lettuce and so on. And he would, as you know, Dennis, he would, if bananas got ripe, he would cut the price and try to sell them. He would bring home the ripest bananas that were to my mother, and bring home the fruit that was just ready to spoil, because he said, I can't keep it in the store any longer. So my mother said, listen, I'm the wife of the owner, and the owner should be bringing me the best, and you're bringing me the... So that is... but I want to say one thing about my mother, because we've talked just about my father. My mother was a wonderful woman in lots of ways. Not only did she raise the children, and when we had lots of personal things to talk about, we talked about it with our mother. But my mother was one of the first people in this country, the rabbi knows this, one of the first people to do Braille work for the blind. She did books in Yiddish. And we would have these huge packages of these big sheets of Braille that were sent to our house, and we had a special room in our house with the special machine, and she would sit there every day of most weeks for some hours doing Braille, and then we'd send them back. She did the Jewish book. She was one of the first.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, Dewey, what was your take on all this? Were you aware of how important the family was? Did you get special privileges at the store? Being a good friend of...
He was just a normal guy. And we hung out together. Mm-hmm. All I remember, I was confused in their kitchen because they kept kosher, and I had no idea what that meant. And I asked a few questions about the milk, why was that? But it didn't matter. And so, no, we just normal guys.
See, that's what I also like. That's right.
Well, that's beautiful. Was there much interaction between the Reformed and the Conservative that eventually formed the Ames Jewish congregation?
You mean what? You mean
between the Mezvinskys and the Ames Jewish congregation in Ames, which was mostly Reformed?
No, because the answer is no, because actually that congregation, as you may know, that congregation first began, as I recall, even after I was in high school. After I was gone. So it began, rather late for us in the family. And also it began, I don't know how it is now, but it began out at Iowa State. And so it was really, first I think begun, which we can understand, for Jewish students who were at Iowa State. So we simply didn't have very much to do with it. We did at the end. We got to know them and they got to know us. But that's really the story. It just started later.
Right. But you know David Gradwell too, very well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was my impression too. That was largely the faculty there. Do you think your career path would have been different if you had grown up in a community like New York City instead of Ames?
It would have been different. If you ask me how it would have been different, I can probably think of a variety of ways. Of course, I don't know, I can't know exactly or fully or even near fully how, but let me try to answer it in a different way. And I've said this often, and I've said it to Rabbi Metzger as well. When I think back about where I grew up and how I grew up, and when I think about things that are very important, values that people have and so on, I have all my life, and I say this now, and it's still true, I'm thankful that I grew up where I grew up in Ames, Iowa. Could have been another place that was similar, but where I grew up in Ames, Iowa, I'm thankful for that, and I'm also thankful that I was able to live as I lived. I mean, you heard Dewey just say, well, as far as he was concerned, I was just a normal guy. Well, he was just a normal guy as far as I was concerned. And you see, that is extremely important to me. And today, when we have so much emphasis upon interfaith and interfaith discussion and what it means, I understand the importance of that, and I try to engage in a good deal of that myself. But actually, that is, to me personally, in terms of how I grew up, a lot of that emphasis is a bit foreign. Because you see, I grew up, no one had to emphasize interfaith to me, because I lived it. And that's what I'm thankful for.
Right, right. Well, besides Abe's legacy, there is a great legacy of diversity. You added so much. Ames, how would you summarize all of this? I mean, you're very thankful for growing up
I'm
here.
thankful for growing up in Ames, Iowa. I mean, we've talked about it, you know, mostly from the religious point of view. But I mean, there are lots of other categories of this as well that are not totally disconnected. But yeah, for me, it couldn't have been. I don't think it could have been a better way for me to grow up. And I mean a better way for me to grow up, to be able to live and survive almost anywhere. I mean, I've lived in the middle of Manhattan of New York City, which is far different than Ames, Iowa. And I've lived there since the early 1960s. So I've lived there the good part of my life. And I'm saying that I believe that growing up in Ames, Iowa, also did for me, made me into the kind of person that can survive very well in New York City and can probably, I hope, survive many other places as well. So that's what I'm thankful for.
Can I throw in a question? 'Cause
Please,
something I'm wondering
please.
about. I imagine that your experience and your brother's are similar, although
Yeah.
obviously different ages and stages. What was it like for your sisters growing up here? Because that's as in Orthodox religious girls.
All right. For my sisters, much of what I said about their friends and growing up in Ames, Iowa, and so on, much of that for them, in their own way, they were older, was the same. My sister Minna, for example, her very best friend, and remained her very best friend until my sister passed away, was, I think her first name was Mary, Rushing. You know, Rushing had the Rushing store. Well, they were the very best of friends, and both of my sisters grew up in the same way, and even when they went off to the university, they lived in a similar way. They both went to the University of Missouri. They both went to Columbia, Missouri. But I remember how it was for them. So I would say it was similar. Maybe not exactly the same, because there was a little difference. There was almost a decade difference between my two sisters, who were about a little less than 2 years apart. And then there was a 9.5-year gap. And then along comes Norton. And 4 years later comes Edward. So there's almost a decade apart, but still I would say very similar.
I hope it's okay. I've asked a few more
Please,
questions.
please,
Okay.
please.
I understand. Obviously, on the high holidays, everyone comes, even the people, the non-synagogue goers show up. But what was it like on a typical weekend Shabbos? Was there a minyan, or
Yeah.
what was it like? A minyan means a community, a small group of.
This is what it was like. In Des Moines, there were, as I think I've told you, there were, when I grew up, 4 synagogues. There was a Reformed temple, a conservative synagogue. The conservative synagogue had the largest congregation. The Reformed temple, which was newer and richer in terms of people who belonged, they had the next largest. Then there was an Orthodox synagogue that we used to call the Fifth Street Synagogue, and it was the larger one. I grew up in an even more Orthodox synagogue called the East Side Synagogue. And so it was small. There was a minyan every Shabbos. Oftentimes, I would go in when I wasn't playing football Friday night. I would go in and sometimes stay with Meyer Dvorsky, with whom I went when I was very young. I went to that synagogue. I grew up in that synagogue, and as you know, that's where that's the religious emphasis that is most important for me. That's why I like, as you know, to come to your congregation, because the nigun is the way the prayers are chanted and so on. That's how I grew up. I know that. That casts the religious atmosphere for me, so that's how it was.
Great. Rabbi, anything else?
This is so fascinating. This is
Absolutely.
this is beautiful. So, describe a Shabbos afternoon in the shul. So Meyer Dvorsky is reading the Torah, I imagine, because he was a jack of all trades, right? He read the Torah.
He would read the Torah.
And was there some sort of class Shabbos afternoon, or did people congregate there?
We had a Kiddush afterwards. A Kiddush is where you come and you say the blessing over the wine, and then you have some maybe things to eat. Sometimes it's a big meal, but we didn't have the big meal. We had that, and so then the afternoon, not, and so that's how the Shabbos, that's how the Sabbath was. That's how Saturday was.
We should probably be winding down. This has been quality time today, gentlemen. Thank you
Thank
ever
you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.